Pinocchio's down at the bottom of the ocean. He's trying to find out where Monstro is. And they ask questions to the fish that are down there, but every time they mention Monstro's name, all the fish disappear. And it's like Voldemort, right? He's the guy whose name you cannot say. And Monstro is precisely that. It's the thing that frightens everyone. Asking questions down there isn't helping very much, and so Pinocchio, what he does is he's calling for his father, and he keeps going deeper and deeper into the depths. The darkness of the ocean turns into an even more profound darkness, and that's what Pinocchio disappears into. And then we see Monstro. He's in this sort of foggy representation, this huge thing that lies very much at the bottom. And there's no life or anything around him except, I think these are mackerel, but they're animated anyway, so it doesn't matter. But there's no life down there. He's so far down at the bottom of the ocean that there's nothing that's alive down there. And then we go inside the whale, which is of course absurd, and we see that the whale has eaten a boat at some point in the past. This is one whopping whale. Gepetto is sitting with the kitten, of all things. He's also got that little goldfish bowl full of goldfish with him too, which is quite the feat. Anyways, he's sitting there and he knows that he's trapped in the belly of the whale too, and that he can't get out. And so that's an interesting issue. It's because not only is Pinocchio lacking his father, which isn't a good thing, but the father is lacking the son. And there's some indication that the father can't get out of the whale without the son. And so it's like the possibility for order is down there in this chaotic state, but unless there's an active agent to go seek it out, it's not animated enough to get out by itself. You know, and you could say, well, there's wisdom in the libraries, but without you going in there and gathering it and embodying it, all it does is sit there in potential in all of that implicit form. That's a good way of thinking about it. So anyways, Gepetto is feeling pretty hopeless because he can't figure out any way of getting out of the whale, and he's also starving. He's starving in the belly of the whale. Here's a way of thinking about that. Gepetto's a good guy, but he's old. And that means his way of doing things is no longer fruitful. That's why he's starving. And it's especially not fruitful because he's missing his son. He's missing the active element that the child represents, say the playful and transformative element that the child represents. And so if you get stuck doing something the same old way, at some point it's no longer going to work. Even if it was good at some point, it has to be updated. And it's updated by, let's call it the spirit of youth, or the spirit of attention, or the spirit of play, something like that. The willingness to break boundaries and take risks. And Gepetto is very, very skilled, but he doesn't have that. And that's symbolized by the loss of his son. That's why he was out looking for his son too. He needs him. And so they're in despair down there, trying to fish and not getting anything. And so Monstro wakes up and he opens his mouth and a bunch of water starts to come in. And then you see Pinocchio with the fish. There's very intense implicit Christian symbolism in this part of the film, and I'm going to lay it out point by point. So you may remember, and perhaps you don't know, that one of the symbols for Christ is a fish, ichthys, right? And that's a play on the Greek representation of Christ's name. But there's more to it than that, because all of Christ's followers are fishermen. And he performs a bunch of miracles with fish. And fish are strange things because, well, you can pull them up out of the depths. That's part of it. And so they're things that can be pulled out of the depth. And you could say that, it's going to be very difficult for me to take this apart, but you could say in some sense that Christ is a meta-fish. A fish is something that you can dine on, but a way of being is something that provides you with something to dine on a continual basis. You might say, well, is it better to have a fish or to be a fisherman? That's another way of thinking about it. And obviously it's better to be a fisherman because then you can get more fish. It's one thing to have something, but it's another thing completely to know how to generate good things. And so if you had any sense, you'd take the latter over the former, even though the former is more instantaneously gratifying and requires less work and responsibility. Anyways, the whale opens his mouth and goes chasing these fish. And Pinocchio he's trying to get the hell out of there, even though he wants to find the whale. When he actually sees the whale, he leaves. And that's also a very common mythological, what would you call it? Plot element. It's very frequently that what happens when the hero first sees the terrible thing, the dragon say, the terrible thing that he's come to conquer, he like freezes and gets the hell out of there because it's far worse than he thought it was going to be. And so Pinocchio, it's like, no way, man. I'm not going near that whale. Way he swims, and he's actually at the forefront of all the fish, which is quite interesting too. In the meantime, Monstro has opened his mouth and the fish are pouring in, and Gepetto is fishing like mad, and he's catching fish like crazy. Gepetto is flinging the fish backwards into this like box, and the little cat is there whacking them to kill them while they're flopping around. And so they're pretty excited about this because they have a problem. The problem is how to get out of the whale. That's the actual problem. But a nested problem inside that is how not to starve to death. And so Gepetto is pretty happy that even though he's not getting out of the whale, that he gets to have something to eat. So you could say as well that he's not exactly focused on the right thing. He's focused on the micro problem instead of the macro problem. And that makes him kind of blind. So anyways, the whale swallows up Pinocchio, and Gepetto keeps fishing. And then he snags Pinocchio. Now this is cool because, and this is another example of that meta fish idea. Gepetto is actually looking not for a fish, he's looking for a way out of the damn whale. And then he catches a bunch of fish and he's like focused on that like mad. And then he catches Pinocchio. And Pinocchio represents what would get him out of the whale, but he's so bloody obsessed with the fish that he doesn't even notice. So he catches Pinocchio and flings him into the fish basket. It signifies the blindness of Gepetto's orientation when he's inside the whale. And that's kind of a comment on his aged and insufficient nature. He's solving the problem very well, but it's the wrong problem. So anyways, he fires Pinocchio into the fish bin. Pinocchio says, "Father, I'm here." And Gepetto says, "Don't bother me right now, Pinocchio. I'm busy fishing." So then he kind of wakes up. He has this little moment of insight, this little revelation that, well, he's caught Pinocchio, so who cares about the damn fish? So then he runs over to the fish box to grab Pinocchio, and instead he grabs a fish and gives it a kiss. And so that it's another way of hammering home the fact that there's this confusion that he's suffering from. He can't distinguish the local truth from the transcendent truth. And so anyways, he does figure it out. He tosses the fish aside and he grabs Pinocchio, and they're all thrilled to death to see each other, and so they're united. So Pinocchio has found his father, but they're still trapped in the belly of the whale. Now Pinocchio takes off his hat, he gets covered with a blanket, he takes off his hat, and he reveals his jackass ears. He's found his father, but he's damaged and not, Pinocchio, he's damaged and not in good shape. He isn't becoming what he was supposed to be. In fact, he's actually degenerated since Gepetto saw him last. He says, "That's nothing, I have a tail too," and then he spins that around kind of laughing. Then he brays and gets really embarrassed, and so that's what you see here. He looks like, well, he's revealed himself as a jackass to his father. But you know, that's actually a good thing, because he is a jackass. And if he was unwilling to admit his insufficiency, he wouldn't have ever gone on this pursuit. It's this perverse willingness to note that he isn't all that he could be that's part of what drives him to find everything that his father represents. It's a humility, and it's an admission of insufficiency. And you need that before you're going to learn anything, because before you learn anything you have to admit that there are things that are important that you don't know, and that you're a fool, and maybe that you're a braying jackass. And so that's why there are injunctions in many religious writings that portray humility positively as the antidote to arrogance. That's the right way of thinking about it, is that humility means I still have something to learn. I still have something to learn. I'm insufficient. I still have something to learn. It's exactly the opposite, say, of Lampwake's attitude. Anyways, Gepetto decides that a son puppet who's half jackass is better than no son at all, which is another indication of his relatively positive orientation towards the world, and they reunite. And then Pinocchio immediately sets his eyes on the main problem. It's like, hey, we're stuck in this whale, we need to get out of here. And it turns out that Gepetto's already built a raft, but there's a problem. Pinocchio says, well, we'll wait for his mouth to open, and Gepetto says that doesn't work, because when he opens his mouth, Monstro opens his mouth, everything comes in and nothing goes out. So raft, fine, but there's no way of using it. Gepetto decides that they're not going to bother with that problem, and they're going to go have some fish. But Pinocchio, his eye is still on the main prize. He thinks, no way, man, we're getting out of this whale. That's the fundamental thing. We're not going to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. We're going to attend to the fact that it's sinking. We're going to keep our eye on the primary problem. So he's a little more awake by now. Pinocchio says, we'll make a fire. Now that's cool, I think, because he's down in chaos where his father is trapped, and the first thing he does is to use fire. And of course that's exactly what people do, right? Because we're fire users. Shaman, for example, are masters of fire. But there's this really primordial element to the story right here, and it's an indication that the thing that can transform order into chaos into productive order is also the same spirit that mastered fire. Pinocchio lays that out, and he says, we're going to build a fire. And Gepetto says, and we'll fill them up with smoke. And Gepetto says, great, smoked fish. So he's still stuck on this whole fish thing. And so Pinocchio runs around gathering up all the spare wood on the boat, including the furniture, which he starts to break. And Gepetto says, well, what are we going to sit on, while we eat our smoked fish? And Pinocchio basically says, politely, enough with the damn fish thing. I'm going to fill the whale with smoke. That's going to make him sneeze, and then we can get the hell out of here. And Gepetto says, that's going to make him mad. It's not a good idea. Well, I would say that that's the stance of the benevolent state against innovation. Even if the innovation is positive, and even if it's transformative and freeing, the old state, even if it's good, is going to stand in opposition to that. And so that's also something that's very useful to know, because otherwise you can get bitter about that. Anyways, Pinocchio makes this big fire. Gepetto's pretty worried about it, and he starts to fill the whale up with smoke. And so this is where the whale turns into a fire-breathing dragon, which is quite cool. It's like in Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent turns into a fire-spewing dragon as well. And if you watch The Little Mermaid, Ursula, she turns into a gigantic snake-like creature as well, although she doesn't exactly spew fire. But the transformation of the ultimate monster into something like a dragon is very, very common, because it's the ultimate symbol of the unknown for a variety of reasons that we'll discuss later. It's a symbol of chaos. This is quite a horrifying scene. When my son he watched Pinocchio when he was about 4, and he watched this scene over and over and over and over. I don't know how many times he watched that movie, but it must have been 100 times. But he was really fascinated by this scene, and he was like locked onto it. It was frightening, but there was something in it that he was processing and cottoning onto. You see the whale is starting to prepare to sneeze, and it's belching out huge quantities of smoke and fire, and Pinocchio and Gepetto and the cat and the goldfish bowl are all on the raft, trying desperately to get out of the whale, which inhales and pulls them back and then sneezes and pushes them forward. And at some point they actually break free, and there's a good gates of hell image there with the whale belching out smoke like mad and its jaws open, and they're paddling madly away to get away from this whale. And the whale is very angry, just as Gepetto suggested, and there's interesting sound effects that go along with this. The whale actually turns into something that's like a locomotive, and the sound effects become industrial. So it's this monstrous machine-like locomotive dragon that's bent on the destruction of Pinocchio. And you could say it's an amalgam of natural and social forces completely unleashed. Everything's unleashed against Pinocchio and his father. And so they're having a hell of a time. There's big waves, and the whale actually abandons them, but before it does that, it nails them with its tail and blows the raft into smithereens. And so then they're both in the water, and Gepetto and Pinocchio are drowning. And Gepetto actually goes down for the 3rd time, so to speak. And as he's going down, he says to Pinocchio, save yourself, save yourself. And so that's kind of Pinocchio's last temptation, because Gepetto's had it, and he could just get to shore on his own, but he would have abandoned his father. And that's one of the issues that this movie grapples with, is what exactly is your responsibility? And you could say, well, it's to save yourself. But the myth that underlies this says, no, it's not. That's not exactly right. It's to rescue your father from the chaotic depths and integrate with that, and to save both. And that's your duty to your culture. But more than that, it's also your duty to your soul. It isn't going to work if you just save yourself, because you're still going to be a jackass puppet, even though you're going to be back on shore. So anyways, Pinocchio grabs Gepetto and carries him to shore, and the whale shows back up and gives him one more good wallop. And then we see everybody on shore, and it's peaceful again. And Gepetto is on his back on the dry land, and the kitten washes up, and the goldfish bowl washes up, and the cricket washes up. He's been outside the whale all of this time. And we see the cricket calling for Pinocchio, and then we see him lying in a pool of water dead. Rescuing his father, he died. Well, why? Well, he is a jackass puppet, and maybe he was supposed to die if he rescued his father, because that insufficiency that characterized him is something that's destroyed by the process of encountering the chaos, which was so difficult it reforms the personality. And the same occurs when he rescues his father and incorporates that. So it's like Bilbo in the Hobbit. He's this sort of jackass puppet guy, a little overprotected shire dweller at the beginning, and he goes on this tremendous adventure, and he has to develop the negative parts of his character. He actually has to become a professional thief, and he has to develop his bravery, and so the old personality in some sense has to die to give life to the new one. And you see in Harry Potter series too, at the very end, Potter dies and then is resurrected, right? And that actually happens to a slightly lesser degree in the second movie, where the resurrection is aided by the phoenix tears after he gets eaten by that, or he gets chomped by that big snake, which is roughly speaking the same thing that's happening here. So anyways, Pinocchio's dead. That's not good. So the next scene we see them back at home, and he's lying dead on the bed. Gepetto and everyone else are mourning his loss. Then we see this magic transformation, and we hear the blue fairy's voice. And so it's like he's pushed himself to his limits, and a natural process kicks back in and revivifies him. But now he's no longer a jackass puppet. He's actually something that's real. He wakes up and he notices that he's undergone this proper transformation. He notices his hands in particular, and then he tells Gepetto, who refuses to even notice. He says, no, Pinocchio, you're dead, lie down. So, you know, Pinocchio convinces him that he's not dead, and then in celebration they start the clocks again, and so time kicks back in at that point. Then they have a big celebration. Music happens again, because this is a celebratory moment, and they dance, and the harmony is restored. The good old guy has his son, and so the house is properly set up, and the old state has its vision and its capacity for transformation, and the thing that transforms has the stability of the culture behind it, and so perfect. And then the cricket goes outside, and he's talking to the star and the blue fairy, and he says he's pretty happy about how this has gone. She gives him this little medal, which is made out of gold, and it's a sun and it's a mandala all at the same time. Gold is a noble metal. It doesn't mate indiscriminately with other metals. It doesn't tarnish. It's a metal that represents the sun, and then he flashes his little badge at the star, establishing a relationship between his function as the proper conscience and his orientation towards the highest good. So he's also transformed and developed as a consequence of this entire process, and now Pinocchio's conscience is properly oriented. It's oriented towards the highest value. And then the movie closes. And that's Pinocchio.